Bourbon is just one of the things we are known for here in Kentucky. Its history is as rich as its taste, and the stories behind the bottles are a huge part of the experience. We know the distilleries of today, but what about those distilleries of days gone by and the stories that may have went with it? One man is using his love of history and archaeology to find those forgotten landmarks and help us get a better taste of the state's signature drink through the stories and people who were distilling spirits long ago. From WKYT Podcast, this is Uniquely Kentucky. I'm your host, Amber Philpott. Welcome into Uniquely Kentucky. September is Archaeology Month here in the Bluegrass, and my guest today is a man who has been digging up the past and the stories behind some of Kentucky's forgotten distilleries and has come to be known as a bourbon archaeologist. Welcome, Nick Laracuente. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I love that term, and I know this is something you're so passionate about because when I met you several years ago at what is called Bourbon Pompeii, you were so giddy about your job. I loved it.
Oh my gosh. Bourbon Pompeii was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I was not expecting that at all.
Let's talk about that. There's a lot I want to talk to you about, but that one is sort of what kind of puts you on the map, if you will, I guess. It's over at Buffalo Trace.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We all know Buffalo Trace for its great bourbon, but when they were going about wanting to put in some new space, some event space, they got to digging around, and lo and behold, there was something really unique that everyone had kind of forgotten about. So take me through what was uncovered.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they were working on making a wedding event space, and they're just like, hey, Nick, we found something old. Can you come and look at it? And they gave me a weekend. Like, if you've ever been in the room, I went in there, and where the catwalks are were all ripped up, and there's backhoes sitting around and stuff, and you could see like old foundations and whatnot down in there, but we didn't really know what we were looking at the time, right? So they're like, well, take a weekend, figure out what we're looking at. We got a construction schedule we want to stick to. And they gave me the best weekend of my life down in the pit, getting dirty. There's like snakes and bugs and stuff. But I was looking at the layers of soil, trying to see what was there, if I could tell what it was. And at the end of the weekend, I come to them and I'm nerding out about the dirt. And I'm like, you could see the flood deposits here. And this is a part of a distillery here. And over in this area, you could see the wall of one of the fermenting vats. And that's what changed the project. It turned a weekend into over a year. And they've actually taken that information that we learned, the artifacts, the words of Colonel E.H. Taylor himself, and they reactivated one of those fermenting vats. And this year, they've been running just fermenting runs in that vat, and they're actually distilling. I think it'll be about 8 years before we get to taste the product. But every single day, I think it's 2:30 is when they do the tours through there. You can go take the E.H. Taylor tour and see Bourbon Pompeii in person. It's just it's awe-inspiring. I don't know how many times now, and I still get little tingles in my arms.
If I understand it correctly, so E.H. Taylor had come in, built a distillery, and that one caught fire because it was hit by lightning, right?
He actually found a distillery when he came in there. It was a Swigert Taylor distillery, I believe, and it wasn't big enough to meet his specs, so he ripped that one down, rebuilt, and lasted about 10 years, and that one got struck by lightning, and he rebuilt again into the OFC distillery. And then that got buried in concrete. At one point around 1950s or so, Shinley Distillers was in there, and they just weren't making enough money. They decided to cut their losses, deactivate everything, and pour a concrete floor. And from that point on, people just gradually forgot it was there until 2016 when we came across it.
You say that you still get goosebumps with that. What does that feel like when you're down there and you're realizing, oh, whoa, this is big. This is something. What's that moment like for you?
Yeah, it's overwhelming. I mean, because some of it is potential. Like, to this day, every time I do an event on Bourbon Pompeii, we learn something new, right? So that potential is always there. And that's the thing that's overwhelming about that, because sometimes the stories are really cool, and sometimes the stories are just out of reach. You have an idea that something really interesting happened there, but you might not have a name, or you might not have, I don't know, all the components to recompose a whiskey or something like that, you know? So that weekend that I was there, I was like, well, you know, this is really exciting, but let's temper this because it might not be enough to kind of change the direction of the project. And I mean, sometimes that's what we find in other excavations is we find some traces of the past, but it's not until you compare them with known sites where you have like a better articulated history, like preserved diaries or something like that, that you can really piece together what happened in another site.
If folks have not gone, this is my one plug to go and see it because it is really incredible. It's really cool how they set it up and you can kind of walk across and see it. And you just feel like for a moment you have stepped back in history. And you say 8 years, maybe the product. I mean, that sounds like a long time away, but that's really not. That will be so amazing.
Yeah, it's going to be incredible whenever we start seeing that in bottles. So.
Nick, I know that you love what you do. And I joked when you walked in the door here today, what have you been digging up recently? Where did you find this love for history and especially archaeology? Because I know a lot of little kids will say, I want to be an archaeologist when I grow up, but that isn't really true reality a lot of times. How did that happen for you?
For me, it kind of happened because I was an Army brat. We moved around a lot. Arizona, we saw like cliff dwellings and whatnot all around there. And I lived in Germany around the time the wall came down. And there's castles and World War II fortifications and all this stuff just like literally in our backyards, right? So I've always grown up with this interest of history. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized you could have a job that actually paid to explore history. Now, sometimes it doesn't pay well, or you're like living in hotels or whatever, so I made some trade-offs, and I have a day job where I do archaeology with the state. That's mostly paperwork, but that enables me to go out on like nights and weekends and actually get my hands dirty doing projects that wouldn't really be tended to otherwise, right? And then the thing that really keeps me in it is just this continual awe. Like last week I went and I spoke to nearly 300 middle schoolers at Elkhorn Middle in Franklin County, right? And I was telling them about Bourbon Pompeii and artifacts around Kentucky and how Kentucky's more than just a dark and bloody hunting ground. There's Native American villages and complex societies here, and the stories just, they never end. Like, every time I go to work, I learn something new, which is awesome, right? But for them, it was also captivating because it turned their backyards into something that was really interesting. It introduced some maybe mystery, some things that had yet to be discovered, right? And that very next day, I ran into some of the middle schoolers, and they introduced me to their parents, and they're like, hey, this is the guy we were telling you about, And then I had to explain why the 7th graders wanted to go to Buffalo Trace, but,
You never know what you inspire. So if it gets them to Buffalo Trace, you've inspired them to maybe move on, not tasting anyway.
Right.
You have carved out a niche for yourself. I mean, I think, archaeology, a lot of times when people think about it, they just think, well, I found a piece of a dinosaur, or I found some, old pottery pieces or things like that. And this bourbon archaeology has really grown, obviously, because in Kentucky we love bourbon, right?
Right.
How do you find the places that you go and try to dig around and uncover and learn about?
Now they're almost coming to me, because initially when I started doing all of this, I was working with the Jack Jewett Historic Site. It's in Woodford County, and they tell the story of the Revolutionary War hero that came and settled in Woodford County and did all these amazing things. And they had a few documents that talked about him as a distiller, right? And at that time, 1794, when distilling's happening, he's not really making a product and aging it in barrels or whatever. He has a still. He's turning corn into whiskey, and he's using it as currency. So the documents were 10 years of lawsuit documents. He traded his distillery for 1,400 gallons of whiskey to a different family. They never paid up. And there's lots of name calling back and forth, but there's lots of details in there as well, right? Enough to lead us to that distillery. So when we figured out that we had the distillery site and we wanted to investigate it, the Jewett House is like, well, why don't we just put out a call on a paper, and we can do a volunteer project, and if people show up, that's great, and if not, then we tried. So the invitation was something like, if you're interested in archaeology whiskey or Jack Jewett, come and join us and learn more about this distillery, right? So 130 people responded to that, and we spent about 2 years. This was probably 2013 to 15 or so, doing this volunteer project, and it went well. We learned all about the site. We know exactly where his distillery was. We actually would have enough information to maybe reconstitute a whiskey that was a lot like Jack's. It might not taste very good. It was in stoneware jugs and not really aged, but we could do it if we wanted to. And it was so unique. We were actually recognized by Washington, D.C. as a Preserve America steward. It's a group of volunteers is kind of filling a niche that is not tended to elsewhere in the professional preservation realm. And we got this plaque from Michelle Obama and all this stuff. So it was really neat. And after that, distilleries just kind of started falling in my lap. People call, they're like, we have a still out in our backyard. We want to know more about it. So now the problem is more of trying to figure out a systematic way to look at these, because there's a lot of work involved. I'm still writing up the stuff from Jewett's excavation and, trying to kind of tie up those loose ends and then choose the next thing that's going to be the best use of everybody's time is the hard part that I'm having right now.
As you've gone through this, Nick, have you learned anything about the distilling process or the way whiskey bourbon was made that's kind of been, oh, that's a revelation, or that's something new that we had forgotten about? Has any of that come about?
Yeah, a few things. It's always interesting when I'm talking with distillers about this, because it's like, this is what this old site looks like, and they're like, oh, well, we deal with that problem this way. So one example is these really old farm distilleries. Most of them in Woodford County are right on the sides of really steep hills, and they end up actually using that elevation to help move the grain from one place to another. So the earliest stage in the process starts really high up, and then the next stage is like slide down the hill a little bit from that, and then eventually you get to the bottom and you can just load your wagon and take it out to the Kentucky River a mile away or so. And when you get into things like grain elevators and stuff like that you see at a modern distillery now, that need to build it on the side of a hill kind of disappears. You still need water, but that necessity to minimize the amount of labor you're using kind of disappears. So it's interesting seeing some different innovations like that. And then there's also who's actually doing the distilling, right? Like one of the very first distilleries I looked at was all the archaeology that was done for Mount Vernon's distillery, so George Washington's distillery, and he used slaves there in making the actual whiskey and such. And then we found evidence that Jack Jewett had also used slaves in his distilling. So there's a whole unwritten piece of history there. It's not that it doesn't exist and it isn't accessible. It's just that it was so hard to get to that nobody's really done it yet. And so we're starting to kind of scratch the surface on that. We still don't know the exact name of the distiller, and we may never find out what his distiller's name was of Jewett's distiller, but we can take that information and we can use it to support people like the Uncle Nearest Tennessee whiskey, right? Where you have a slave, Nearest Green, who actually taught Jack Daniels how to do his distilling. And they have there all these documents, the things that we don't have at these early Kentucky distilleries, but we can compare those experiences and kind of flesh out stories. So that part's just fascinating, and I don't really know if there's another way at getting at it, you know? One of the exciting things that just happened in the last month or so is I met Dr. Erin Gilliam over at KSU, and she's looking at the archival evidence of the African-American experience in the distilling industry. And she's just really started her research, but already she's opening up some stories that haven't really got that light of day to them yet, you know? So there's juicy stuff there, and it's just fascinating learning more about that.
What a fascinating portion of history that I would think that we should know is right there, but it's probably one of those things we've just never stopped to think about. That will be really amazing to see what comes out of all of that work back and forth. Sure. What's your coolest find outside of Bourbon Pompeii?
Yeah, good
and
qualifier.
I'm talking about maybe pieces or artifacts, that kind of thing.
Right. Well, it's interesting because the distilling process, especially with really early distillery, people are either very poor or they're very meticulous with their work environment. So with the Jewett distillery, we didn't find a lot of artifacts within the distilling complex itself. And we think us because they're keeping the floors swept. You don't want to be doing distilling and like walking on old garbage, right? So we only really found like one or two pieces of stoneware jugs, but one of them that we found, it looks like it was probably made somewhere locally, maybe Lexington, maybe for sale, something like that. But you can actually see the thumbprints from the person that was making this jug in it. And when you get artifact like that, and you can actually like physically put your fingers where somebody has before, that sort of thing. You can see my hair standing on my arms right now. So it's incredible, but it also helps with that connection because the volunteers that we're working with, whenever they get to share that experience, that's one of the main things that keeps people in archaeology, I think, and even if the volunteers don't become archaeologists, there's different ways that they could use archaeology if they got into, tourism or working in main streets or whatever, So just the knowledge of this is here, an archaeologist, once you get them fired up about something, they will share what they know with you, So it's just interesting kind of making those bridges.
Also, it's just such a sense of pride for people to come out and be involved in something like that, where maybe we might find something, maybe we don't. But if we do, as you said, being able to think that I'm kind of walking the footsteps of someone else, or I'm touching something that someone so long ago, that sense of pride is real.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then there's other connections, too. Like I always carry with me this is a jaw harp that my grandfather gave me, and we actually found one of these at the Jewett site. It looked a little different, and it was missing the twanger thing in the middle, right? But when I found it, I was like, I know that I've seen one of these before. Where was it? And Grandpa was the one that was telling me, he's like, this is what it is and how it worked and whatnot. And so for me, that was like a personal connection through the artifacts, but it also helps you excavate like what the place looked like, right? Or what it sounded like in this case, because especially with early distilling, there's a lot of waiting around for the temperatures to get right and whatnot. And so while you're waiting, what are you doing? In this case, somebody was playing music on that site. And or cooking food, because we found some remnants of like pig bone that had been boiled and charred and left in a campfire and stuff like that. So you can get kind of pictures of, there was probably the smell of cooking meat, the sound of a jaw harp playing, maybe the sound of like grain on metal as they were like crunching it up in the grist mill. And when I first got into archaeology, I didn't really think that you would be able to piece together those kind of intangible things, So this is very cool.
We know, obviously, how popular bourbon is. We know the tourism factor that it has. But now, sort of archaeology and the things that are being uncovered, it's adding a whole new layer to that. That's got to be pretty cool to sit back and watch as well for these distilleries now, to be able to add this extra layer of history into their site and what they're offering to folks that come to see them. Oh,
for sure. And that's one of the things that really got me interested in distilling in the first place, right? Because usually a bourbon consumer, they're after authentic histories. So like you mentioned earlier, you're looking at stories in a bottle, right? You're not just downing some a tasteless vodka or something like that, right? You're interested in why the label looks like it is, or maybe there's a specific story behind the shape of the bottle or the people on the bottle. And that desire for something authentic is what makes a lot of people that maybe are interested in bourbon, they're also accidental preservationists. So we're allies, even though we might not realize it at first. And that sort of thing is pretty amazing.
What would that moment be like if you uncovered a bottle of bourbon?
Depending on what it was, I don't know if it would be safe to drink or
not.
Absolutely. Right? Because of that, all that rectified stuff. That would be my luck. I would find one that had like sulfuric acid in it or tobacco juice in order to get that color right. But I think it'd be pretty incredible. I know I was reading some early excavations by Ivor Noel Hume in the Virginias, and he actually went down in a well and he found like a cherry brandy bottles that were still sealed. And I don't know if they ever drank them or not, but just going through that process, for me, I think the more realistic thing might be finding like a yeast jug or something like that and having that authentic strain of yeast and having the mash bill and being able to reconstitute what that looked like, and just that hands-on experiment working with some of the distillers that are interested in this thing. That right there is kind of my dream. And we're even looking at working on some of these moonshine sites out east would probably be the next place that I'm working. There's hundreds and hundreds of rock shelters in Daniel Boone National Forest that have moonshine in them. And there's one that the forest rangers took me to a few months ago that it looked like somebody had just kind of dropped their stuff after law enforcement came, and there's kind of broken mason jars, but other than that, everything is left as is, so it's amazing being able to see, like, all right, this is what this place looked like. If the moonshine was good, it would be interesting to try to reconstruct it, but I don't know about finding one that was whole.
Nick, I don't need you to drink that. I need you to be around a lot longer so
Okay.
we can uncover more stuff, right? Talk to me about the world of technology, because I imagine that has probably maybe made your life easier. I don't know. But, with 3D imaging and printing and things like that, I don't know if those are things that fit into your world, but it seems like technology may make it easier. Or do you still do the old simple get down and dig around?
It's one more tool in the toolbox, right? Because there's not really an archaeology tool store, unfortunately. Most of the time we're borrowing tools from other people. So the main one's like a brick mason trowel that we sharpen up and things like that. But my very first experience with bourbon archaeology was out here at the James Pepper area where Bourbon distilling and all that is, right? The parking lot that's paved right now, whenever I first saw that place, it was all gravel. And they let me run a ground penetrating radar over it. And through that radar and through overlaying a bunch of maps through GIS on the computer, I could actually see the signature where there was a brick warehouse foundation underneath that parking lot. And there's by lining up the maps, I forget the exact age of it, but we could actually figure out what age that particular warehouse was. So it helps on things like that, because I guess you could still get there through like transparencies and graph paper and drawing a lot, right? But with a few clicks on the computer, you can get a lot of that work done. And then there's some other things that are incredible. Like when we went to Bourbon Pompeii, there was somebody that came in. I've never actually met him in person, but he came in on the weekend, and he put down a machine that took thousands and thousands of high-res photos and stitched them together into a dollhouse. And you can actually get online on this website and see and like spin around Bourbon Pompeii when it's in construction. And that was incredible to me, because it's not digging, but it's preserving the site in a way that I've never ever seen before. And you can actually get some Google glasses and put it on and like look around like you're actually there in the dig, So that really helps whenever I'm talking with like school classes on Skype or something. We could pull that up and they could see what I was seeing when I was in there doing the digs. So it's incredible.
This month is Archaeology Month, and I love that we put that out there for the whole state, and we really do invite people, as you said, to really get involved. There's something coming up in the Red River Gorge where folks can get involved, right?
Yeah, it's the 31st year of the Living Archaeology Weekend, and that is a place where oh gosh, there's so much there. So there'll be thousands of school kids that come in on Friday, and then on Saturday, anybody that wants to go, and it's almost a religious experience, because you go through the Nada Tunnel and you get around to Glady, and there's all these reenactors and demonstrators there, and what they're doing is they're showing how we have the same problems, us and historic people and people who lived in the prehistoric era. We all had the need for clothing, the need to get food, the need to hunt, whatever. And we just used different technologies in order to get those, complete those goals, right? And so if you go, you can actually get your hands dirty. You can scrape animal hides. You can try out some food that's cooked on open fire. You can throw an atlatl, so a long dart that people used to hunt game thousands of years ago. And then you can also learn about plant domestication, because in Red River Gorge a few thousand years ago is one of the first places that things like corn and squash and chenopodium were domesticated. And we found all that through archaeology in those areas, right? And so the same time that people are doing like rice or potatoes or stuff like that in other areas of the globe, that was happening in Red River Gorge. And so you can go, and sometimes archaeology is not obvious, but the thing that makes Living Archaeology Weekend cool is every single thing that you see in the demonstrations there is tied to something that we've learned through archaeology. And it's just awe-inspiring watching like the Living Archaeology Steering Committee and Daniel Boone National Forest kind of spend a year putting this together to make it as perfect as possible. And after 31 years, it's jaw-dropping. So definitely go out. The event's free, and you can get some Miguel's Pizza or whatever on your way out there, and that's always a fun experience too.
Did I that only 10% of Kentucky has been surveyed? Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, maybe just slightly more than that. But
Right.
I mean, really, archaeology in Kentucky started in 1930s officially, maybe before that, if you count people like Rafinesque, who did some of the early maps of Kentucky. But I mean, William Webb, who documented a lot of the Indian earthen mounds around Kentucky, was really groundbreaker, literally, at finding some of the things. But right now, we have documented something like 33 to 34,000 archaeological sites around Kentucky, and it's everything from Paleo-Indian sites, which is featured on the poster of Kentucky Archaeology Month this year, up to the distillery sites of 50 years ago. So literally thousands of years of Kentucky history is just buried underneath the ground, and we unpack it almost like turning new pages on a book, right? And then to go with that, I mean, we also have been documenting all the old structures that are around. This building even looked like it had a little bit of age on it, right? And we've documented about 130,000 of them. And usually when you have an old building, there's some sort of archaeological site with it. So there's definitely not a shortage of things to do around Kentucky as an archaeologist.
Nick, do you think there's something out there, or is there, let me phrase it this way to you, is there something that you haven't been able to find that you want to find, that you've, kind of honed in on, but you haven't gotten there yet? Or is there just something that you think, what do you think is just out there waiting to be found?
Oh, my goodness. At the moment, I can't think of something offhand, but it's more of because there's almost too much. Like, so one of the reasons that I decided to completely put on that kind of, I don't know, the bourbon archaeology uniform, right, is because I feel like with distilleries, I can address pretty much any question that I'm interested in over time, because it's a microcosm of Kentucky society at any one point in time. But really, if anybody went out there, say there's an archaeologist that's looking to do a dissertation project or something, and they want to look at hemp, I could guarantee you that there are sites out there that would speak to the archaeology of hemp, which would be a pretty good idea to start getting on top of right now, right? So, but I mean, literally, even with all the sites that we've documented in that 10% we've looked at so far, you can look at almost any aspect of Kentucky society, Kentucky history, and it's just a matter of starting with that kind of framework that our predecessors have put together for us and building on top of that by choosing the right site or talking to the right person, or maybe taking technology that didn't exist 30 years ago and looking at some old artifacts in a new way. So that sort of thing is incredible to me. And I guess the biggest problem is finding more time, because there's almost more questions than there are time to look at them, right?
Yeah, and you have to write about everything that you find. So that's a lot of time. I read this and I thought it was very special because I know how passionate you are about your job. But it sounds like you have someone following in your footsteps. Your daughter is quoted in an article saying that you said, she said, I like the things, but it's more cool learning the stories about the people who use those things. That's pretty remarkable for a little girl to say. And now I have goosebumps, right? That's got to mean a lot to you.
I'm very proud of her. And I think part of it is because I've been dragging her to every single presentation and dig that I've done. There was one time that she actually took over the podium, had me step to the side, and started talking about the artifacts that she found during a dig with me. And we had to have a talk with one of her teachers about the fact that she knows a little too much about bourbon, but it was because of what I do. But it's encouraging, though, because it's like one of the reasons that you really get into this is that when you have development, like new shopping centers, stuff like that going in, right? We're literally bulldozing away parts of our history. And so a lot of archaeology, a lot of the stuff that I see in my day job, it involves like new construction and whatnot. We are literally saving some of the last vestiges of these stories. And if we don't do it and get it documented, that stuff could be gone forever. And then people like my daughter, or maybe even her kids, may never get those stories. And that's one of the things that kind of drives me and others in this profession, is making sure that we don't lose those really important things. That is like, this is why it's important to be a Kentuckian,
Very well said. Nick, if people want to find more about your work or if you're, speaking places, where do people find you? How do people keep up in touch with you?
I'm on Facebook at a page called Bourbon Archaeology and on Instagram at the same Bourbon Archaeology. And I kind of pop up all over the place lately. So I'm doing a talk at the Paul Sawyer Library tonight and then one at the Scott County Library tomorrow night. And then on October 4th or 5th, I'll be in Newport talking at the Kentucky's Edge Bourbon Conference. And I'm sure there'll be something on the Bourbon Archaeology Facebook page that talks about when that's happening. But other than that, just reach out on Facebook if you got questions or family distillery you need looked at. I generally get back to you as soon as I can, and it's always fun.
Well, one of the questions that I always ask every guest on here, we called this podcast Uniquely Kentucky. What do you think makes us so unique, Nick?
Oh, wow. I think the thing that makes us unique is just that my interests have really aligned with the bourbon communities, and that kind of support and cooperation is something that I've not really encountered before, because I could be feeling overwhelmed about, like, I don't know the answer to this particular question that I'm dealing with. And the next thing I know, I'm talking with somebody from Wilderness Trail Distillery just last week, talking about yeast strains and how we might dig them up. And they gave me all of the scientific information about yeast that I didn't really know. And that sort of thing, that kind of collaboration as Kentuckians, as people that are interested in bourbon, that's something that's unique to me. So I think that it is an awesome environment to work in, and that's why my career is here.
Nick, I don't know how you keep all that information in that brain of yours. One day I think your head's going to explode, but I appreciate you, and thank you so much for what you're doing, for keeping history alive and for inspiring others. It's a really good thing to see.
You're welcome, and thanks for inviting me to talk today.
All right, keep on digging, okay?
Okay.